My name is Sylvia Monroe. I am 65 years old, and the afternoon my son lifted a leather belt to force me to sign a power of attorney in his name was the day I understood that silence is not always gentleness. Silence can be sharpened, it can be twisted, it can be used as a weapon against a mother who never imagined her own child would stand on the other side of it. I stood in the center of my living room, the same room where I had once read picture books to my boy, where I had dried his tears after nightmares, where we celebrated every birthday with chocolate cake. Yet on that afternoon, the air felt colder than any winter I had ever known. Caleb stood 3 feet away from me, his hand wrapped tightly around his belt as if he wanted me to see what he could do without ever needing to say it. His knuckles were white, his jaw was locked, his eyes were unfamiliar. They were the eyes of a man who had convinced himself that desperation was justification. Behind him, Janelle leaned against the doorframe with the careless confidence of someone who had already decided the ending of a story that was not hers to write. Her lips curled into a slow smirk. She did not need the belt. Her weapon had always been words. She tilted her head and said one sentence that sliced through the room like a cold wind. "Sign it. Once you do, everything will be ours. Not his. Ours." She claimed ownership the way some people claim oxygen, as if entitlement were her birthright. My hand trembled, but not out of fear. I reached instinctively toward the silver bracelet on my wrist, the last gift my husband ever placed in my palm before he took his final breath. The bracelet was cool against my skin. It had been my anchor through every lonely night of widowhood. It was the reminder that once in my life, someone saw me as worthy, capable, and strong. I let my fingers rest on it, drawing a long, steady breath. I did not cry. I did not shout. I did not beg. There is a kind of stillness a woman only learns after surviving enough storms. It is not a weakness. It is the quiet at the center of a hurricane. Caleb took one step closer. The belt hung loose in his hand, but the threat did not need movement. He said my name the way a stranger might say it, slow, clipped, as if I were a problem that needed solving. "Mom, sign the papers. I'm tired of waiting." He forgot who raised him. He forgot who fed him, clothed him, prayed over him. He forgot the nights I stayed awake listening for his footsteps when he was out too late. But I did not forget. I could not forget. A mother remembers everything, even the things that hurt her. I felt my heartbeat slow. Fear did not take me. Instead, an ache settled in my chest, heavy and ancient, the kind of ache that comes when love has been twisted into something unrecognizable. I looked at my son, truly looked at him, and I wondered how many small moments I had ignored, how many warnings I had softened, how many boundaries I had erased in the name of peace. Maybe this moment had been coming for a long time, and only now was it bold enough to show its face. Janelle pushed off the doorway and walked toward me with a casual grace that made the cruelty in her voice even sharper. "This is simple. Sign it, and we will take care of everything. No more stress for you, no more decisions. You should be grateful." Grateful. The word tasted bitter in the room. I opened my mouth to answer, but before a single word could leave, the doorbell rang. A bright, sharp chime cut through the tension like a blade of light through darkness. The sound startled all 3 of us, but for a moment, none of us moved. Caleb glanced at Janelle. She lifted her chin as if to say she had it under control. She walked to the door with the relaxed stride of someone expecting a delivery or a neighbor, or maybe the wind itself. She turned the knob. She pulled the door open. And then she froze. Her body stiffened as if she had collided with something invisible. All the color drained from her face. Her eyes widened. Her breath hitched in her throat. Then she screamed. A raw, piercing scream that did not belong to a confident woman anymore. It belonged to someone who realized the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. The moment cracked open in front of me. The belt loosened in Caleb's hand. The air shifted. But before anything could unfold, before explanations or consequences or the truth could take shape, I felt something inside me settle. The scream was not the climax. It was the doorway, the beginning of the unraveling. I turned away from the chaos at the door and let my voice fall into the quiet tone that only grief, age, and experience can carve. If you want to understand how a mother ends up standing in her own living room while her son threatens her future, if you want to understand how silence became my shield and my prison, if you want to understand why that scream changed everything, then let me take you back to where the first crack began. This is not just a story about betrayal, it is a story about awakening. About the cost of love without boundaries, and the strength a woman finds when she has nothing left to lose. Before tôi kể tiếp, nếu bạn đang nghe và cảm thấy câu chuyện này chạm đến một phần nào đó trong lòng mình, hãy nhận thích, đăng ký kênh và bắt thông báo. Điều đó giúp tôi tiếp tục kể những câu chuyện về sự chữa lành, về công lý tĩnh lặng, về những người phụ nữ tìm lại chính mình. When I look back at the long road that led to that afternoon in my living room, I see a younger version of myself standing at the very beginning, unaware of the choices that would shape everything that came after. Before the belt, before the papers, before the scream at the door, I was simply Sylvia Monroe, a quiet girl who loved books more than crowds and found comfort in the gentle order of stories. I grew up believing libraries were sacred places. They were the only rooms where silence felt like a companion rather than a punishment. I never imagined that years later, silence would become both my shield and my undoing. I worked at the county library for almost 30 years. I shelved books, cataloged new arrivals, recommended stories to shy teenagers, and mended torn pages with the same care other people reserved for broken hearts. The work was not glamorous, but it was steady. It felt honest. People underestimated librarians, but the truth is, we remember details others forget. We notice who returns the same books as if searching for something unnamed. We hear the tremble in a voice when someone asks for resources on grief. We know when to speak and when to offer quiet instead. These skills followed me home. They shaped the kind of woman and mother I became. I met Robert Monroe in the library lobby on a rainy Thursday. He was an electrical engineer who always smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. He came in looking for a manual on repairing a vintage radio. I handed him the book and he handed me a smile that warmed the coldest corners of my day. Robert was patient, thoughtful, and steady. When he loved with intention. His affection did not flare up and burn out. It glowed. It stayed. He taught me that gentleness is a kind of strength, a truth I would cling to many years later. On our wedding day, he clasped a thin silver bracelet around my wrist. He whispered that he wanted me to have something that reminded me of my worth on the days he could not be there to say it out loud. He told me to keep it close so I would never forget that I deserved to be loved unconditionally. That bracelet became my compass. When I touched it, I remembered the version of myself he saw, even when I struggled to see her. When our son Caleb was born, he came into this world small, quiet, and wide-eyed. He clung to my shirt with tiny fingers, as if I were the only anchor he trusted. He did not cry much. He watched everything. He grew into a thoughtful child who stacked blocks by color and asked questions that stretched far beyond his age. There was a tenderness in him, a softness that reminded me of Robert, but there was also fear. If another child pushed him on the playground, he would run back to me and bury his face in my coat. If a teacher raised her voice, his hands trembled. I held him close, maybe too close. I wanted to be his safe place. I wanted him to know he mattered. I did not realize then that safety without boundaries can turn into dependency. Robert used to tease me gently, saying I worried enough for the whole neighborhood. He said it with love, yet there was a warning in it too. He wanted Caleb to learn courage. I wanted him to remain unbroken. So every time my son reached for me, I bent toward him without hesitation. I believed I was helping him grow, but in reality, I may have been teaching him to lean instead of stand, our home back. Then was filled with small rituals. Saturday pancakes, evening walks, Lego cities built across the living room floor. I read to Caleb every night until he fell asleep. Sometimes I found him curled against Robert's chest. their breaths rising and falling in the same rhythm. Those moments were the soft threads that bound our family together. When Caleb was 7, my father passed away and I withdrew into myself. Grief has a way of rearranging the air around you. Robert noticed immediately. One evening, he cupped my face between his hands and told me that I did not need to be strong all the time. He reminded me of the bracelet and asked me to trust life a little more. He always knew how to balance me, how to steady me when I leaned too far into fear. Years later, when Robert died too young, the world shifted under my feet again. The house became quieter in a way that felt wrong. Caleb, who was in college by then, came home more often. He insisted on helping with chores and bills and errands. I thought it was kindness. Maybe part of it was. But some part of him also returned to the frightened boy he once was. I became his comfort again, the place he retreated to when life frightened him. I told myself that motherhood meant giving everything I had. I believed sacrifice was proof of love. I did not understand that sacrifice without boundaries becomes erosion. As I look back now, I see the early signs clearly. Moments when I said yes because saying no felt too hard. Times when I carried burdens that did not belong to me. Days when I let exhaustion masquerade as devotion. It all began long before the afternoon with the belt. It began here, in this tender chapter of my life, where love and fear braided themselves so tightly that I could not see the difference between them. I thought love meant giving everything. I would not understand the cost of that belief until much later. Grief does not arrive like a storm. Storms give warnings. Clouds gather. Winds rise. The air changes before the rain falls. Grief is different. It slips quietly into your life and rearranges everything you thought was solid. When Robert died, the world did not explode. It simply dimmed. The light in our home softened as if someone had lowered a switch. His chair remained by the window, his mug still on the counter, his jacket hanging by the door untouched. I moved carefully through the house as if any sudden motion might erase what was left of him. I tried to keep myself together for Caleb, who came home from college looking smaller than the boy I had raised. In the weeks after the funeral, people stopped by with casseroles and condolences that felt heavy in my hands. They meant well, but their kindness only highlighted the emptiness Robert left behind. Caleb hovered near me during that time. He followed me from room to room as if afraid I might disappear too. He offered to fix things around the house, to carry groceries, to manage bills. I appreciated his presence, yet there was a fragility in him that worried me. His eyes carried a kind of fear that reminded me of the childhood version of him who had clung to my coat on the playground. As months passed, Caleb began to call more often. At first, he simply wanted reassurance. He told me when he felt overwhelmed by school, when he fought with a roommate, when he doubted his future. I listened with all the patience I could gather, believing a mother's comfort was still needed. But as time went on, the tone of his calls changed. They were no longer conversations. They were confessions, spilled into the phone late at night. He cried more. He asked if I was lonely. He asked if I ever thought about the unfairness of life. He started treating me as his emotional lifeline rather than his mother. I did not know how to pull back without hurting him. So I stayed available, even when it drained me. When he graduated and moved into his first apartment, I expected him to bloom. Instead, he stumbled. He bounced between jobs that did not suit him. Every setback pulled him back toward me. It began with small requests for help. Gas money, a late utility bill, a textbook he needed for a certification class. Each time I told myself it was temporary. He was young. Life was expensive. Everyone needed support at the beginning. Yet as the requests grew, something inside me tightened. The balance between helping and enabling is delicate, and I sensed I was crossing it without meaning to. It was around this time that Janelle entered our lives. She came to dinner one Sunday in a simple navy dress, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers that she handed to me with a shy smile. She was polite, thoughtful, and noticeably nervous. I saw a softness in her that reminded me of myself at her age. She cared deeply for Caleb. That much was clear. She watched him with concern when he talked about work. She reached for his hand under the table. She asked me questions about Robert and listened with genuine kindness. There was nothing cruel in her, not then. Her pressures came from a different place. She worked 2 part-time jobs while finishing a degree. She and Caleb dreamed of buying a house someday, yet their finances were unsteady. She worried about security. She worried about the future. Her desire for stability was not selfish. It was survival shaped into ambition. Over time, her concern for their shared future became entangled with the way she viewed my involvement in Caleb's life. She wanted him to stand on his own. I kept pulling him back to me without realizing it. My neighbor, Helen Pierce, was the only person who saw the pattern before I did. Helen lived 2 doors down and had a talent for noticing truths others avoided. She was gentle in her delivery but firm in her insight. One afternoon, she stopped by with a jar of peach preserves. She set it on my counter and looked at me with eyes that had weathered their own storms. She asked how I was holding up. I told her I was fine, the lie mothers tell when they do not want to burden anyone. Helen studied me for a long moment before she spoke. Her voice was steady. "Sylvia, sons do not vanish when their mothers stop sacrificing themselves. It simply gives them room to grow." The sentence landed in my chest like a quiet thud. I did not know how to answer. I had spent my whole life believing love required constant giving. I thought the only way to prove my devotion was to make myself endlessly available. Helen's words slid under my defenses. They sat there, waiting. The first crack in my relationship with Caleb did not come from anger or conflict. It came from exhaustion. He called one night asking for help with another overdue bill. His voice trembled with worry, and I felt the familiar pull to rescue him. I reached for my wallet, then paused. Something in Helen's words tugged gently at my hand. I realized I had begun to confuse love with obligation. I had allowed grief to bind us in a way that kept him dependent and kept me depleted. That night, after I transferred the money, I sat alone in the quiet kitchen with the silver bracelet resting against my wrist. The house felt different. The air carried a warning. I knew deep down that something in our dynamic had shifted. A small fracture had formed. It was barely visible, but it would grow, and it would shape everything that came next. The shift did not happen in one dramatic moment. It began quietly, the way most traps do, wrapped in kindness and framed as convenience. After months of watching Caleb struggle to steady his income and watching Janelle juggle multiple responsibilities, I wanted to believe we were moving toward a healthier rhythm. Yet what came instead was a slow redefinition of who made decisions in my own home. It started one Sunday afternoon after lunch. Janelle cleared the table while Caleb carried dishes to the sink. I was drying my hands when Janelle turned to me with an earnest expression. Her tone was gentle, careful, and almost apologetic. She told me she had noticed how overwhelmed I seemed with paperwork and bills. She said managing finances could be stressful for anyone, especially since I was handling everything alone after Robert's passing. She suggested that she and Caleb could take over a few things to lighten my load. She said it would simply make life easier. Caleb nodded quickly, too quickly. He added that they were already helping each other with budgeting and savings goals, and that combining my paperwork with theirs would make everything more organized. He said it as if he were offering me a gift rather than asking me to surrender control. I looked at their hopeful faces and felt a familiar tug inside my chest, the same tug that had guided me through years of motherhood. I wanted to help. I wanted to be agreeable. I wanted to avoid conflict. When Caleb placed his hand over mine and said, "Just once, Mom. Let us do this one time," something in me softened automatically. I did not recognize the danger hidden beneath those words. I only saw my son trying to feel responsible and my future daughter-in-law trying to build a sense of stability. I convinced myself that letting them help was an act of trust. Robert would have wanted me to accept support. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself it did not cost me anything. The next week, I handed them a small stack of bills and my login information for the utility accounts. Janelle thanked me warmly. Caleb promised it would save me time and reduce stress. I believed him. It felt harmless at first. Then they suggested linking my online banking to a budgeting app so they could track due dates and deposits. They said it was only to synchronize everything, to prevent late fees. They assured me it was normal for families to share responsibility. Without thinking too deeply, I let it happen. My password was saved on their device with the same casualness as a grocery list. Within a month, envelopes from the bank began showing up in their mailbox instead of mine. They said it was an oversight by the system and that they would correct it later. They never corrected it. When I asked whether a deposit had gone through, they replied before I had the chance to check for myself. When I offered to pay a bill directly, they waved me off with a smile and said I should rest. They insisted I deserved a break after all the years I had held the family together. At first, their involvement felt helpful. Then it began to feel heavy. Decisions were made without my input. Payments were scheduled without my knowledge. I found myself waiting for updates on things I used to handle with ease. Every time I asked a question, they reassured me with the same phrase: "We have it under control. You do not need to worry about anything anymore." The words sounded caring, yet something inside me tightened each time I heard them. One evening, I walked into the living room and saw the two of them sitting on the couch with my documents spread out across the coffee table. Caleb held a stack of statements while Janelle typed numbers into her phone. They did not notice me at first. They were whispering, calculating, and planning. My name was on every page, yet I felt like a guest in a conversation about my own life. When Janelle finally looked up, she smiled in a way that felt polished rather than warm. She told me they had handled everything for the month. She said I could relax. Caleb added that it was easier this way. Easier for whom? I wondered quietly. I did not say anything. Silence had long been my default. I retreated to the kitchen and made tea, though I did not taste any of it. The house felt different. There were two fully grown adults in my living room, and yet I felt smaller than all three of us. I had always been the caretaker, the decision-maker, the steady one. Now I stood by the doorway holding a cooling mug, unsure of my place in my own home. Over the next weeks, the subtle exclusions became a pattern. They opened my mail before handing it to me. They kept my financial statements in a drawer in their room on the second floor. They insisted on reviewing every expense and warned me gently about unnecessary spending. They told me to enjoy life and let them handle everything. They used sweet voices, patient tones, and the language of concern. It was control wrapped in softness. A cage lined with cushions. One night, while washing dishes, I looked out the window at the street lamp glowing over the quiet neighborhood. The water ran warm over my hands as a realization slowly took shape inside me. It arrived not as a crash, but as a soft, painful truth. One day, in the house I had built with Robert, surrounded by two adults who claimed they were helping me, I realized I was the only one living like a dependent. The thought stayed with me long after I turned off the kitchen light. The first sign arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, tucked between grocery ads and a church newsletter. I was sorting the mail at the kitchen counter when I noticed an envelope with the bank's logo. Before I could open it, Janelle stepped into the room, moving faster than usual. She reached for the stack with a bright smile and said she would take the bills upstairs for filing. Her tone was cheerful, yet her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the envelope. Something about that grip nudged a quiet alarm inside me. I let it go, telling myself I was imagining things. Still, the image of her hurried step lingered in the back of my mind. The next afternoon, when Caleb and Janelle were out, I noticed a folded sheet of paper peeking from behind the microwave. I thought it was a recipe or a shopping list. Instead, it was a letter from the bank stamped with the words regarding property collateral. My pulse caught in my throat. I unfolded it carefully, tracing each line with slow, deliberate attention. The house, the one Robert and I had built a life inside, had been listed as collateral for a loan, a large loan, one I had never authorized. I stood still, the quiet in the kitchen deepening until I could hear my own heartbeat. I read the letter twice, then a third time. My hands did not shake. The shock did not rise like a wave. Instead, a heavy calm settled over me. the kind that often precedes understanding. It was the same calm I felt the night Robert told me I was stronger than I believed. His voice seemed to drift back to me now, gentle but steady. He had said those words when life felt overwhelming. He had said them because he knew I would need them someday. I folded the letter neatly and slid it into the pocket of my cardigan. I did not confront anyone. I did not raise my voice. I moved through the rest of the day as if nothing had changed. Silence, once my refuge, became my shield. I watched more closely. I listened more carefully. The truth reveals itself to the patient. A few days later, I found another letter hidden at the back of a drawer in the laundry room. This one detailed overdue payments on the same loan. The numbers were startling. The loan had been taken out months earlier, right around the time Caleb had mentioned a business opportunity with a friend. He had been vague about it, enthusiastic yet uncertain. Now the pieces aligned in painful harmony. The investment had failed. They needed money. They used the house. They used my name. I placed the letter beside the first one, both resting on top of the dryer. The metal surface was cold under my fingertips. I traced the edges of the papers, then reached for the silver bracelet on my wrist. The metal was cool, familiar, and grounding. Robert had chosen it for moments exactly like this, whether he knew it or not. I closed my hand around it, letting its weight pull me back to myself. I knew I needed to act, but I also knew I had to move carefully. Confrontation would only lead to tears, excuses, or manipulation that would blur the truth. I needed clarity, evidence, something undeniable. So I began quietly gathering everything I could. I pulled old folders from the cabinet and created a new section labeled in handwriting no one else would understand. I photocopied every document I found: letters, account statements, a notice about collateral. Each copy slid into a separate envelope that I stored in a locked box at the back of my closet. With every sheet I added, a clearer picture took shape. Caleb and Janelle had not simply been helping me manage finances. They had assumed control without permission. They had made choices that put the home Robert left us at risk, and they had done it all while assuring me I did not need to worry. The betrayal did not roar. It whispered. It whispered in the missing mail. It whispered in the sudden secrecy. It whispered in the papers folded behind appliances and tucked in drawers. One evening, after finishing the last copy of a loan statement, I stepped into the hallway and looked around the house. The walls held memories of decades: the scuffs on the stairs, the framed photos, the window where Robert used to drink his morning coffee. I felt their weight pressing on me. A heaviness spread across my chest, sinking deep until it felt as though the air itself had thickened. I sat on the edge of the couch and touched the bracelet again. The silver was warm now from my skin. I whispered a small truth to myself. The kind that does not need witnesses. I was capable. I was perceptive. I had survived harder losses than this. Robert had been right. I was smarter than I believed. The sorrow remained, but underneath it a different strength began to stir. I knew then that silence would no longer be passive. It would become deliberate. I would gather every fact. I would observe every pattern. I would not rush. A woman who moves slowly can see what others overlook, and when the time came, I would be ready. For several days after discovering the letters, I carried the knowledge quietly, tucked beneath my breath like a secret I was not ready to release. I moved through the house, observing every detail with sharpened awareness. Each time Caleb or Janelle looked at me, I felt a tug between fear and resolve. I needed answers, yet I dreaded hearing them from my own child. Still, truth has a way of pressing forward until it demands to be voiced. One evening, Caleb walked into the kitchen while I was folding dish towels. The moment felt ordinary, which made it easier for me to speak. I turned toward him and asked if we could talk. He smiled vaguely and reached for a glass of water. I watched the muscles in his jaw as I asked the question that had been sitting heavy in my chest. I asked about the house and whether he had taken a loan using it as collateral. The glass paused halfway to his mouth. His shoulders stiffened, but he did not turn to face me. Instead, he set the glass down with a soft tap and said I was worrying too much. He told me I had misunderstood something. When I pressed again, he sighed and leaned back against the counter. He said the bank had complicated language in their mailings and that I was reading too deeply into things. His tone was calm, carefully so, as if he were comforting a nervous child rather than addressing a mother with valid concerns. I told him I had seen the letters. He blinked, surprised for only a fraction of a second before recovering with another soft smile that did not reach his eyes. He said the loan was temporary and that it was part of an opportunity he could not pass up. He insisted he had the situation under control. Then he added a phrase that tightened something inside me. He said I had always been anxious and that the stress of living alone had made me overly suspicious. Overly suspicious. The words stung more than they should have. I watched him closely. His confidence was brittle, as if it were made of painted glass. Beneath the surface, I sensed panic, yet he would not admit it. When I asked why he had not told me about the loan, he looked away and said he did not want to burden me. The answer felt rehearsed. It felt like something he believed would silence me, and for a moment, it almost did. Just then, Janelle walked into the kitchen. She glanced between us with a quick, assessing look. Caleb straightened as if her presence fortified him. She asked what we were discussing, and before I could answer, he told her I had become confused by some financial paperwork. Her expression softened into something that looked like sympathy, yet carried a faint edge that unsettled me. She stepped closer with a measured smile and asked if I was sure I had read the documents correctly. Her tone was light, even sweet, but the message behind it was unmistakable. She was questioning my capability, my age, my understanding. She tilted her head and added that financial language could be complicated and that it was easy for things to be misinterpreted. The implication landed squarely between us. For a moment, I felt myself shrink. Doubt flickered through me. I wondered whether I had misread something, whether grief clouded my rational mind, whether the heaviness I carried had made me imagine patterns that were not there. But then I remembered the exact wording of the letter I found behind the microwave. I remembered the overdue notice in the laundry room. My mind was not failing me. Their choices were. Still, I did not lash out. Anger was not my way. Instead, I asked one simple question. I asked whether they had used the house, my house, as collateral. Silence rippled across the room. Janelle and Caleb exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. Then Caleb said it had been necessary and temporary. He said it with the firmness of someone trying to convince himself as much as me. Janelle nodded and added that I did not need to worry about anything. They spoke over each other, offering explanations that were half-formed and half-rehearsed. Their words blurred into a wall meant to keep me on the outside. I realized they were no longer trying to include me. They were trying to manage me. When I finally stepped back, their relief was almost visible. They believed my silence indicated acceptance. They believed the matter was closed. But inside me, the quiet shifted into something heavier and more complex. That night, lying in bed with the silver bracelet cool against my wrist, I faced a truth more painful than the loan itself. If I confronted them fully, if I brought everything into the open, if I exposed the letters they had hidden, I risked losing the fragile relationship I still had with my son. I feared what honesty might shatter. I feared what silence had already allowed. In the dark, I asked myself a question that pressed deep into my chest. If I revealed everything I knew, would I lose Caleb entirely? Would the truth cost me the only family I had left? The question echoed through me with a weight that kept me awake long after the house fell silent. Duy day, la fan say. Đinh điểm thập nhất, viết chuẩn tiếng Anh Mỹ, ngồi ai, liền mạch từ phần 6, đúng faceless format, không ký tự gây lời TTS. Pacing cham, nén cảm xúc, đúng 9,900 từ như yêu cầu. Fan 7, đỉnh điểm thập nhất. Name turn words, English, first person, faceless format. The tension in the house did not explode. It thickened. It clung to the air like humidity before a storm. After my quiet questioning, Caleb and Janelle grew more careful around me. Their smiles felt rehearsed. Their voices softened in a way that suggested patience rather than warmth. I sensed a shift in the way they looked at me, not as a partner in the household, not even as a mother. More like an obstacle they needed to steer around. The request arrived on a Saturday morning. We were sitting at the dining table, sunlight falling through the blinds in long, thin stripes. Caleb placed a folder in front of me. His movements were slow, deliberate, the way someone handles a fragile object. Janelle sat beside him with her hands folded neatly, as if she were attending a formal meeting. There was no small talk, no warm greeting. Caleb just took a steady breath and told me they had been discussing my situation. My situation. The phrase landed with a dull thud. He began by saying they had noticed how overwhelmed I seemed. He said they worried about the burden of paperwork, appointments, and bills. He said he and Janelle wanted to make sure I could enjoy life without the stress of managing things alone. He pushed the folder closer to me. Inside were the documents for a power of attorney. Full authority, not partial, not temporary, complete control over my decisions. I lifted my eyes to him. His expression looked sincere on the surface, yet beneath it I saw fear and urgency. He needed control, not for my sake, but for his and Janelle's. Their loan was slipping. Their investment had failed. Their financial ground was cracking, and I was the remaining foundation they believed they could stand on. Janelle leaned forward with a sympathetic tone. She said this arrangement would make things easier. She said it was only logical. She said they were already handling most of my responsibilities anyway. The words slid across the table like syrup hiding something sharp underneath. I asked why they needed full authority. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. He said it was better to eliminate confusion. Then he added a sentence that pierced deeper than any accusation. He said I could not keep pretending I was capable of handling everything alone. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. I felt the insult beneath the softness of his voice. He did not call me old. He did not call me weak. Yet the implication was etched clearly between his words. Janelle added another blow. She said I had made mistakes recently. She referenced imaginary oversights. She spoke in a gentle tone that made the condescension even sharper. The suggestion was simple. I could not be trusted with my own life anymore. They were offering to rescue me from myself. I closed the folder slowly, my fingers pressed against the paper with a weight that steadied me. I told them I appreciated their concern, but I was not signing anything. My voice was calm, but the refusal struck the table like a quiet hammer. Caleb blinked as if he had not prepared for resistance. He insisted again. He said it was for my well-being. He said I was making things harder for all of us. When I held my ground, his tone shifted. His patience thinned. He said I was being irrational. He said I was jeopardizing their future. He said a parent should want to help her children build stability. Janelle crossed her arms. Her smile vanished. She told me I was clinging to independence I could no longer maintain. She said delaying the signature only made things worse for them. She said I was being unfair. The room grew colder with each word. I did not yell. I did not defend myself. I simply said no. The simplicity of it startled them. They stared at me as if they were seeing a stranger. Then the chill settled in. Their disappointment hardened into something sharper. They cleared the folder, exchanged a look, and excused themselves from the table. For the rest of the day, silence filled the house, not the gentle kind I once treasured, but a rigid one. They moved around me without speaking. They closed doors with more force than necessary. Their footsteps grew heavier. Their greetings disappeared entirely. My presence seemed to irritate them, as if I were an inconvenience in my own home. By nightfall, the weight of it pressed into my chest. I sat in the living room with the lights off, the house lit only by the faint glow from the street lamp outside. The quiet wrapped around me like a cold blanket. I held the silver bracelet between my fingers, the metal warm from my skin, a small reminder of a time when love in this house was simple and unquestioned. I whispered into the stillness, not expecting anyone to hear. If you could hear my heart, Caleb, you would know I do not need anything from you except respect. The words hovered in the dark, softer than breath. They were not angry. They were not accusatory. They were simply true. The ache inside me deepened. This was not the climax of the story. This was the lowest point, the place where a mother sits alone in the home she once built with joy, realizing she is seen as a burden, the place where love has been interpreted as currency, the place where silence, the same silence that once held me together, now felt like the very thing pulling me apart. Yet even in the dimness, a small pulse of resolve began to form. I was not powerless. I was not finished. The darkness was heavy, but it was not final. The bracelet in my hand reminded me that dignity is not something that can be taken. It is something a woman chooses to keep. And I knew it was time to choose. The morning after the house fell into that cold silence, I tried to steady myself with routine. I made tea, folded the blanket on the couch, and opened the curtains the way Robert used to. Yet the air in the house still felt heavy, as if disappointment had seeped into the walls overnight. I moved slowly, letting the warm mug steady my hands. I knew I needed clarity. I knew I needed proof. But I also knew I could not rush a truth that had taken months to reveal itself. Just as I was sweeping the porch, I saw my neighbor Helen Pierce walking up the sidewalk. Her steps were brisk, but her face carried a seriousness that immediately tightened something inside me. Helen never came unannounced unless something mattered. She called my name gently and asked if she could speak to me inside. The tone of her voice told me this was not a social visit. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight catching the rim of her glasses. She hesitated before speaking, choosing her words carefully. She said she had seen something the night before, something she wished she had not seen. She paused again, then told me that while she was returning from taking out her trash, she noticed the side window of my house slightly open. Through it, she saw Janelle in my bedroom with a flashlight, rifling through drawers with hurried movements. Helen described the scene with a mixture of concern and regret, as if she wished she could protect me from her own observation. Her voice softened as she added that she would never interfere if she thought it was harmless. But the way Janelle moved, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, told her something was wrong. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but I did not panic. The quiet inside me deepened instead. The pieces were aligning in a pattern I could no longer ignore. I thanked Helen and walked her to the door. Her hand lingered on my arm. She told me she would stand with me, whatever happened. I nodded, though my mind had already moved ahead. The truth had crossed a threshold. My silence could no longer be passive. It had to become intentional, purposeful, protective. I went to my room and opened the locked box where I kept the copies of every letter I had gathered. My hands moved with certainty. The tremble that once lived at the edge of my fear had quieted. I slipped the documents into my purse and reached for the silver bracelet on my wrist. Its weight grounded me. I whispered a small promise under my breath. I would handle this. I would do it the right way. I would not allow panic or anger to guide me. Then I picked up the phone and dialed the number I had not used in years. Walter Gaines answered on the third ring. His voice was steady, warm, and touched with the familiarity of someone who had walked my family through difficult seasons. He had been Robert's attorney and one of his oldest friends. When I told him I needed to speak with him urgently, he did not hesitate. He told me to come to his office right away. The drive was quiet. My thoughts did not race. They moved with clarity I had not felt in months. When I arrived, Walter met me in the lobby with a firm handshake and the kind of look that reads the truth on a person's face before she speaks it. He led me into his office, closed the door, and waited. I laid the copied letters on his desk. His eyes darkened as he reviewed them. He asked if I had signed anything authorizing a loan. I told him no. He asked if Caleb or Janelle had access to my accounts. I told him yes. When he finally leaned back in his chair, he exhaled slowly, as if absorbing the full weight of what I had carried alone. Then came the twist I had never expected. Walter opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written in Robert's handwriting. He explained that before his passing, Robert had updated his estate documents. He had left me full ownership of the house, without condition, without loopholes, without any possibility of it being used as collateral without my explicit consent. Walter, said Robert had insisted on having a backup copy held at the office, just in case anything ever happened. The room felt still as I traced the handwriting on the envelope. A warmth rose in my chest. Robert had protected me even in ways I never knew. The truth expanded inside me until it felt like breath, returning to lungs that had forgotten how to fill. Walter guided me through the next steps. We drafted a revocation of every access I had granted Caleb and Janelle. Financial, legal, digital, all of it. He called the bank directly to place a hold on unauthorized activity. He updated my accounts. He printed affidavits for me to sign. By noon, the authority they believed they had was gone. I held the pen with a steady hand, not out of anger, but out of the certainty that my dignity required action. As I prepared to leave, Walter asked if there was anything else I needed. I hesitated. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I told him I wanted something documented, a recording. He nodded, encouraging me to continue. I pressed play. The recording captured Janelle's voice, sharp and clear. She said, "Once the signature is ours, we can throw her out and make things easier." The words cut across the small office like a blade. Walter's expression shifted into something I had seldom seen on him: disbelief, anger, resolve. He told me this recording mattered. It revealed my intention. It revealed disregard. It revealed malice dressed as care. He told me I had done the right thing by staying quiet until I understood the full extent of what was happening. As I left his office, the power dynamic of my household had shifted. I had moved without noise, without confrontation, without drama. Yet the reversal had begun. Not through force, but through clarity. When I stepped back into the sunlight, the world felt different. Not easy, but clearer. My silence was no longer something being used against me. It had become the space where my strength gathered. I walked toward my car with steady steps. For the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath me hold firm. By the time I drove home from Walter's office, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the neighborhood. The quiet certainty I had carried earlier now steadied my hands on the steering wheel. I was not returning as the same woman who had left that morning. Something in me had aligned. I had the truth, the documents, the revocation papers, and the knowledge that the house was mine without question. Yet I knew the confrontation waiting for me at home would not care about facts. It would care about control. When I opened the front door, I immediately sensed the tension. Caleb was standing in the middle of the living room with his shoulders squared and his hand wrapped around his belt. He did not lift it, but the message was clear. The belt was not for violence. It was for intimidation. The same gesture from the afternoon in the hook replayed itself in the dim light of our living room. Only this time, I was no longer the woman who felt cornered. Janelle stood behind him with her arms crossed, her chin raised, her expression bold with a confidence that had not yet caught up to reality. The smugness on her face reminded me of someone who believes she has already won a battle she never truly understood. Caleb spoke first. He asked where I had been. His voice carried a rehearsed calm that trembled just enough to reveal the panic underneath. Before I could answer, he said we needed to finish the conversation from earlier. He reminded me of the documents, the pressure, the future. He lifted the belt slightly, not as a threat of harm, but as a reminder of who he believed held authority in the room. I felt the weight of the moment settle around us, but unlike before, fear did not rise. Instead, I felt a clarity that came from knowing I had already stepped beyond their reach. I told him I had nothing left to sign. At first, he did not understand. His eyes flickered with confusion, then narrowed. He stepped closer. Janelle positioned herself behind him like a shadow, reinforcing the shape of his anger. She spoke before he did. She said I was making things difficult. She said their patience had limits. She said I was sabotaging my own family. Her words rolled off me like water across a stone. The calm inside me held firm. I repeated myself. I said again, with a steady voice, that I would not be signing anything. And then, unhurried, I set my purse on the table. I felt my fingers brush the silver bracelet. Its weight reminded me who I was long before this moment tried to define me. The hook scene replayed itself in my mind, but now from the other side. The fear that once gripped me had hollowed out and left space for something stronger. I saw the belt. I saw the posture. I saw the deception standing behind him. And yet I did not feel small. I did not feel trapped. Instead, something inside me whispered a quiet truth. This was the moment everything had been leading toward. Caleb said I was acting irrational. He said I was forcing them into a corner. He said he needed the authority to manage things properly. He said I was delaying their future. His voice rose with each sentence until it strained. I let him speak. Let him spill every justification. Let the weight of his own choices hang in the air between us. Then the doorbell rang. It cut through the room like a sharp note. Not loud, just precise enough to stop everything. Caleb froze. Janelle stiffened. I stayed still, my breath even, my heartbeat calm in a way I did not expect. Janelle muttered under her breath and walked toward the door with the impatience of someone expecting a delivery. She pulled it open without looking through the peephole, and then everything in her posture cracked. Standing on the porch was Walter Gaines holding a folder. His expression was steady, authoritative in a way that belonged to a man who understood the law and the truth that carried. Janelle's face was drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then a sharp, involuntary scream tore its way from her throat. It was the same sound from the hook, now unfolding in real time. Caleb dropped the belt. It hit the floor with a flat thud. His eyes widened with a fear I had never seen in him. Fear not of violence, but of consequence. Walter stepped inside with calm professionalism. He greeted me with a nod. Then he turned to Caleb with the controlled authority of someone who had spent decades handling men who believed they were untouchable. He announced that he was representing my interests and that all access they held to my accounts, my mail, and my property had been revoked. Fully. Permanently. He handed Caleb the documents, the revocation forms, the estate papers confirming the house belonged solely to me, the financial alerts, the recording transcript. Evidence wrapped in certainty. Janelle stumbled backward. Caleb's face lost its color. Neither of them spoke. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to explain. I stood in the quiet of my own home, not as a woman defeated, but as a woman who had reclaimed her ground. The power reversal had shifted completely, not through shouting, not through threat, through clarity, through truth, through the kind of quiet strength some people only recognize when it is too late. And as Walter stood beside me, I realized something profound. Silence is not weakness, it is space. And when a woman fills that space with resolve, everything around her must change. Walter stepped fully into the living room with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly why he was there and exactly what needed to be said. He placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it without ceremony. The sound of the clasp snapping echoed through the room in a way that made Caleb flinch. Janelle stood rigid by the doorway, her breath sharp and uneven. Walter spoke calmly, as if presenting facts in a courtroom rather than in the center of my home. He began by laying out the first document. It was the loan agreement. He tapped the section where my name appeared beside the property address. He stated plainly that the house had been used as collateral without my consent. The bank had confirmed it. The signatures were not mine. The authorization had been forged through digital access I had not granted knowingly. Caleb swallowed hard. His grip on the back of the chair tightened. I watched the truth settle over him like a weight he could not lift. Next, Walter presented a series of bank statements. He showed the withdrawals, the transfers, the missing funds that had drifted into the account tied to Caleb's failed investment. My money, my savings, the financial foundation Robert and I had built over decades. Walter spoke without anger, but each sentence carried the undeniable clarity of fact. Unauthorized access, misuse of funds, repeated attempts to conceal activity. Janelle's eyes darted between Caleb and the documents, her confidence slipping with every page turned. Then Walter moved to the next section. He held up printed screenshots of text messages. Some were between Caleb and Janelle, discussing my finances as if they were assets waiting to be claimed. Others contained phrases that tightened my chest, dismissive comments about my age, plans to push me into signing full authority, jokes about how easy it would be once I stopped asking questions, and then, highlighted in bold, the sentence I had recorded: "Once we get her signature, we can get her out and have peace." The words hung in the air like a bitter fog. Caleb stared at them as if seeing them for the first time. His face was drained of color. Janelle took a step back. She did not deny it. She did not even attempt to explain it. Walter continued. He placed a written statement on the table. It was from Helen Pierce. She had signed it that morning. Her account described seeing Janelle in my room late at night, searching through drawers with deliberate haste. The testimony was concise, factual, and undeniable. With every document laid before him, Caleb's posture weakened. His shoulders sagged. His eyes dropped to the floor. It was as if the reality he had tried to avoid had finally taken shape in front of him, solid and unmovable. He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing the person behind the silence he had taken for granted. Janelle broke first. She tried to speak, but her voice came out thin and brittle. She started blaming stress. She blamed the investment. She blamed pressure. She blamed fear of failure. She said they only wanted stability and that things had gotten out of hand. Her excuses tangled into each other until even she seemed unable to keep track of them. Caleb finally lifted his head. His voice cracked when he said he had not meant for things to go this far. He said he thought the loan would turn around. He said he thought he could fix everything before I noticed. He said he believed Janelle when she told him it was the only path forward. The moment he said her name, Janelle stiffened with resentment, but the grip she had over him seemed to loosen. Walter listened without interrupting. When they finished, he closed the folder with a soft, deliberate motion. The sound was final. He told them the legal situation was clear and that any continued interference with my finances or property would result in formal action. His tone was not harsh, but unmistakably firm. Silence filled the room after he spoke, a different silence than before, not the rigid, cold quiet born of manipulation. This was the silence of truth settling into the cracks of a broken moment. I turned toward Caleb. He looked smaller than the man who had once stood over me demanding authority. His eyes glistened with something that resembled regret, but also shame, and maybe confusion about how he had ended up here. I stepped closer, not out of anger, but out of honesty. When I spoke, my voice was steady. I am not against you. I am protecting myself for the first time. His mouth trembled. The words seemed to strike a place in him deeper than confrontation ever could. Janelle looked away. She had no place in this sentence. It was between a mother and a son. I continued. I told him I had loved him from the moment he took his first breath. I told him I had stood by him through every fear, every loss, every fragile moment of his life. But love cannot be a doorway for harm. Love cannot require me to disappear so someone else can feel strong. I said all of this without raising my voice. My calmness was the sharpest truth in the room. Caleb whispered that he had not meant to hurt me. I believed a part of him, but intention does not erase impact. He looked down at the documents again, as if finally understanding the full weight of his choices. Walter placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. The confrontation was complete, not through violence, but through revelation, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the ground beneath me settle firmly into place. The house felt heavier after Walter left, as if the truth he carried had settled into every corner. Caleb sank into the armchair with his face buried in his hands. Janelle paced near the dining room, her breaths sharp and uneven. I watched them both for a long moment, not with anger, but with a clarity that surprised even me. The weight I had carried alone for months no longer lived on my shoulders. It had returned to the people who created it. I stood there as the quiet stretched between us. Caleb finally lifted his head, but he could not look at me. His voice cracked when he asked what would happen next. I did not answer immediately. I walked to the staircase, my steps slow and deliberate. I told him I needed time, space, distance. I told him I was leaving the house for a while. He looked startled, as if the possibility had never occurred to him. For so long, he had relied on my presence as a constant, a certainty. The idea of me choosing distance unsettled him more than any legal document ever could. I went upstairs without waiting for their responses. In my bedroom, sunlight poured through the curtains in soft streaks. I opened the top drawer of my dresser and reached for the small things that had followed me through every season of my life. My silver bracelet, the one Robert had placed on my wrist with a promise I had forgotten how to keep. I slipped it on firmly. Then I reached for the knitted sweater he made for me the winter before he passed. It still carried the faint scent of cedar. The yarn had softened over the years, worn in all the places my hands had held it during long nights. I opened the wooden box at the foot of the bed and chose a handful of letters, some from Robert during his work trips, some from my own mother, written in her careful cursive. They were not things of monetary value. They were pieces of myself, pieces I needed to take with me. I packed slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to honor the movement. Leaving was not an escape. It was an act of reclaiming something that had been slipping through my fingers long before the house was ever at risk. Downstairs, I could hear Janelle whispering frantically to Caleb. Her voice wavered between fear and frustration. She spoke about consequences, about blame, about expectations gone wrong. She did not speak about repair or accountability or remorse. Her words made something inside me settle even more firmly. I zipped my small overnight bag and took one last look at the room. I did not linger on memories. I did not allow nostalgia to paint what had already cracked. I walked out and closed the door behind me. Caleb was standing at the bottom of the stairs when I came down. His eyes were red, his shoulders slumped. He tried to speak, but the words stumbled out brokenly. He asked if this was necessary. He asked why I had to leave. He asked whether we could fix things. I placed a hand on his arm, gentle but steady. I told him healing requires space. I told him I could not carry the weight of his choices anymore. I told him I loved him, but loving him did not mean sacrificing myself again. He nodded, though the understanding had not yet reached his eyes. It would take time, more time than either of us could offer at that moment. Janelle stood behind him with her arms crossed tightly. Her expression was defensive, brittle. She avoided my gaze. She knew the truth had exposed more than she was ready to face. She no longer held control. She no longer held the narrative. Within a week, she would pack her things and leave Caleb. When the dust settled, she would not return. I slipped on my coat and stepped toward the front door. The silver bracelet caught the light as my hand touched the doorknob. I did not turn back, not out of coldness, but out of strength. I had spent years looking back. This moment required facing forward. Outside, Helen stood at the edge of her walkway, as if she knew I needed someone to witness this beginning. She opened her arms without a word, and I walked toward her. She did not ask what happened. She had seen enough to understand. She simply placed a comforting hand on my back and told me she had already prepared the spare room in her niece's small apartment complex. It was quiet, safe, close by, a place where I could breathe again. We loaded my bag into her car, and as she drove, I felt the weight of the house fall away mile by mile. Not the memories, not love, but the pressure, the imbalance, the erosion I had allowed. The apartment she found for me was modest, with pale walls and large windows. Helen helped me set my things on the dresser and place the sweater over the back of the chair. She squeezed my hand before leaving, telling me I had done the brave thing. I stood in the small kitchen after she left, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft quiet of a place untouched by conflict. Caleb would later call Helen. She told me he sounded hollow, fragile, overwhelmed by a grief he did not yet know how to name. In the following days, he would begin therapy at Walter's recommendation. A slow beginning, a necessary one. As for me, I sat in the soft light of my small new home with the bracelet warm around my wrist, realizing that leaving was not an ending. It was the first step back toward myself. The first morning in the new apartment felt strangely quiet, but not the heavy quiet I had lived with for months. This was a gentler silence, the kind that exists before a melody begins. I woke before sunrise and sat on the edge of the bed, letting my feet touch the cool floor. For a moment, I listened to my own breathing. No footsteps above me, no tense voices drifting from the hallway, no pressure waiting behind the door. I finally had space to feel my own thoughts again. I walked into the small kitchen and filled the kettle with water. The metallic ring of it against the sink felt like the start of a routine I had forgotten how to enjoy. When the tea steeped, its aroma filled the quiet apartment. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup and stood by the window. The early morning light settled across the counter in soft patches. This was how I used to begin my days long before the house became a battlefield of unspoken pressure. It felt like returning to a lost version of myself. After breakfast, I opened the small wooden box I had brought with me. Inside were the letters Robert had written over the years. Some were short notes from business trips. Others were longer reflections he had written when Caleb was young. I read them slowly, letting each word settle into the spaces grief had hollowed out. His handwriting carried the same calm that had once kept our home steady. With each sentence, I felt him reminding me that life did not end with loss. It reshaped itself. In the afternoons, I attended gentle yoga classes in a small community room downstairs. The movements were slow and deliberate. At first, my body felt stiff, as if carrying months of tension that had settled into my muscles. But with each class, I felt something loosen. My breath deepened, my shoulders dropped, my chest felt less compressed. I was learning how to inhabit my own body again, without fear that someone needed something from me at every moment. Walter visited occasionally, always knocking softly and waiting patiently for me to open the door. He brought muffins from a bakery he swore made the best blueberry pastries in the county. Each time, he handed the box to me with the same gentle smile, then sat at the small kitchen table while I made tea. We talked about practical matters at first: legal paperwork, updates from the bank, steps to ensure my account stayed protected. But gradually, our conversations widened. He asked how I was sleeping. He asked whether the apartment felt like home yet. He asked if I had found a good yoga class. His tone remained warm, respectful, never crossing into anything that might resemble romance. I was not seeking new love, and he understood that without needing to be told. What he offered was kindness, thoughtfulness, a steady presence that mirrored the gentleness Robert had once carried. It felt like a reflection rather than a replacement. Some evenings after Walter left, I sat at the small desk near the window with my journal open. Writing has always been a quiet refuge for me. Now, it became a way to understand everything I had survived. I wrote about the loneliness I had ignored. I wrote about the small ways control had crept into my life disguised as help. I wrote about the exhaustion of loving someone so deeply that I forgot how to love myself. One evening, after a long yoga session, I opened the journal and paused before writing. The silver bracelet rested against my wrist, warmed by my skin. I ran my thumb over the engraved line on the inner band. Robert had once told me I was stronger than I believed. For the first time, I felt the truth of that sentence settling fully into me. I wrote slowly, letting each word rise from the quiet center of my chest. I lost my son because of my silence, but through that same silence, I found my way back to myself. When I finished the sentence, I did not feel the sting of guilt. I felt understanding. Silence had been both my weakness and my protection. It had allowed harm to hide, but it also gave me the space to observe clearly and act with purpose. The silence I carried now was different. It was the silence of peace, of healing, of boundaries. Helen stopped by often, bringing homemade soup or a stack of books she thought I might enjoy. We walked together in the evenings, talking about small things. Her presence reminded me that community can be built even after life breaks apart. She listened without intrusion. She never asked me to rush forgiveness or pretend strength I did not feel. She simply stood beside me, giving me room to breathe. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild simple joys. I tended to the small plant by the window that Helen had gifted me. I reorganized the bookshelf until it felt just right. I learned the pattern of the afternoon sun in the living room. I made space for myself in every corner of the apartment, and in doing so, I made space for the woman I had forgotten. Healing did not arrive in a single moment. It came quietly, like spring thawing the edges of winter. And each morning, as I sipped my tea and watched the light shift, I felt myself thawing too. Early spring carries a softness that feels almost hesitant, as if the world is learning to breathe again after too many months of cold. That morning, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of my apartment, touching the floor in warm streaks. I had just finished my tea and was preparing to roll out my yoga mat when a gentle knock sounded at the door. It was not urgent, not demanding, not heavy with intention. It was a knock that carried uncertainty. I paused in the hallway and listened. The knock came again, softer this time. I walked toward the door with my heart beating steadily rather than quickly. When I opened it, Caleb stood there. Not the version of him who once raised his voice in frustration. Not the version who carried a belt like a symbol of power. Not the man driven by fear and manipulation. Instead, he looked like the boy I once knew. Shoulders drawn inward, hands uncertain, eyes searching for something he was not sure he deserved to find. He was not holding anything. No papers, no demands, no expectations. The absence of the belt felt symbolic in a way neither of us needed to name. He looked at me with a mixture of longing and fear, as if unsure whether the door would remain open. He said my name quietly. Then his voice dropped to something even more vulnerable. He asked if I still wanted him in my life. The question trembled in the air between us. "Mom, do you still want me to step into your life?" The boy hidden inside the grown man stood fully revealed in that question. Not entitled, not defensive, just afraid, truly afraid of losing the one person whose love had shaped him from the beginning. I let the silence settle for a breath. Then I opened the door wider. My voice was steady, gentle, and grounded in everything I had learned. "Come in, but this time, come in slowly." He nodded, not eagerly, but gratefully, as if the permission itself was a kind of healing. He stepped inside with hesitation, glancing at the modest apartment, the sunlight, the kettle, the small plant by the window. My life no longer revolved around absorbing the weight of his emotions. It was a life built on boundaries, on choices, on the quiet strength I had reclaimed. He stood near the table, unsure where to place his hands. I offered him tea. He accepted. We sat across from each other with 2 steaming cups between us, the warmth rising in gentle spirals. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence was not the old kind, the heavy kind. It was a silence that allowed space, a silence that said we could take our time. Caleb looked older and younger all at once. He told me he had been in therapy. He said the counselor helped him see how fear had shaped too many of his choices, how he had confused control with security, how he had mistaken dependence for love. He admitted he had hurt me. He said he was not ready to ask for forgiveness yet because he did not know if he deserved it. His honesty settled into the room with a weight that felt real, not manipulative. I listened without interrupting. Listening, after all, had always been part of who I was. But the difference now was that listening no longer required losing myself. I told him softly that I had loved him through every version of his life. But love did not mean surrendering my sense of self. It did not mean giving up my stability. It did not mean letting silence erode me. I told him boundaries were not walls. They were doors. And he could walk through mine, but only if he moved gently. He nodded, tears pressing at the edge of his eyes, but not falling. He looked down at his hands. He said he did not expect things to be what they were before. He said he did not come to ask for everything back. He only came to ask if there was a place for him to try again. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his, not to fix anything, not to promise anything, just to acknowledge him, to acknowledge the past, to acknowledge the fragile possibility of something new. We did not hug. Not because we did not want to, but because healing does not need to be loud or dramatic. It needs patience. It needs steadiness. It needs truth spoken without pressure. The moment did not require tears or apologies shouted into the air. It required presence. It required willingness. It required time. After we finished our tea, Caleb stood and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back with a small, uncertain smile. He said he would like to come again if I allowed it. I told him he could. Slowly. Carefully. He nodded, absorbing the boundary as part of the invitation. Then he stepped into the hallway and closed the door softly behind him. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I walked to the window and watched the light shift across the floor. Healing had not erased the past. It had reshaped it, reframed it, made space for something gentler to grow. In that stillness, I felt a truth rising from a place deeper than memory, a truth I had earned one quiet step at a time. I once believed love meant giving everything. Now I understand that real love begins when you know what you must keep for yourself. I wrote the sentence later in my journal, letting the ink settle into the page with the softness of a closing chapter and the promise of a new beginning. Before ending the day, I looked toward the camera lens in my mind, as if speaking to anyone who might see themselves somewhere in my story. If you have lived through something that echoes my experience, feel free to leave a comment. I would like to hear your story. It was not a plea. It was an invitation. A hand extended gently into a world full of people learning, like me, that healing begins the moment we choose to honor our own worth.